Hello, and welcome back to the War of Ideas podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about a story. The story I will be talking about is Steven Pinker and his new book, Enlightenment Now, versus the world. That's a bit of an exaggeration. Maybe versus people whose side he's actually on, and those people are too blinded by rage for what they think somebody is to see what Pinker is saying through an objective lens. And this story will serve for the theme that I want to get at for this episode. And these types of things happen all the time. And I'm pointing this specific one out because it is so easy to tear down and catch these people in the act of attributing thoughts and actions to people that those people have never uttered, solely from the confabulation that goes on in their own minds, because subconsciously they don't like that person, and they may not like the people this person associates themselves with, which is true in the story I will be talking about today. And so, if you are already on some level slanted towards disliking somebody, they could give you the biggest compliment in the world, and somehow you will find a way to think they have some ulterior motive and are trying to do something evil or imprint some pernicious idea on society by saying what they say. And it's very difficult, but we need to start teaching people to remind themselves every single time they read something or hear something said by someone they already dislike to start fresh. And hey, I would not be making a podcast about this if it was about Alex Jones, and for once in his life he said something that made sense and people still made fun of him for it. Because when you're talking about the worst of the worst, I will not be bothered into putting effort into having people actually care what Alex Jones says and to actually dissect it, because odds are it's not worth your time. But how many Alex Jones are there out there in the world? Not that many. You have to be willing to think about your own initial thoughts of what somebody just said or what article you just read. We have to quite literally go through our own thoughts with a fine-tooth comb and think to ourselves, what made me react this way? And is this the correct reaction to have? Is this how I really feel? Could there be something influencing my reaction to this? And I think a part of today's society that exacerbates this problem is that for every hot topic that gets passed around on social media, there's some amount of journalists who have to make their opinion about it, even if that news that they're writing about is so uninteresting and boring. And once one person writes about it and it catches on, a chain reaction starts. A whole bunch of other news outlets write about it. And some of these people are hoping to create outrage, or they do it because, hey, you have to write about something. You have to make an article once in a while, and why not make one about this current event that is getting a lot of traction now, and everybody will forget about it in a week. You gotta get those clicks, you gotta have people read your article, or why does that news company keep you around? And I see the irony in me talking about this right now, but in my defense, I am repudiating these things that I find to be toxic to our society. And I wouldn't be talking about this if I thought people weren't making mountains out of molehills or piling on certain individuals based on belief or based on the mob they belong to. Alright, I'm going to play a clip of a YouTube video from the Michael Brooks Show. This is someone I actually agree with on almost everything, and I could not believe my ears when I heard him and his friends talking about Steve Pinker this way.
Steve Pinker has a new book out. I forgot the
Enlightenment Now.
Enlightenment Now, which is essentially a kind of manifesto of delusion for the modern prayer, delusion, and empathy-free fantasy life of the modern managerial class.
Ignoring the mocking tone that Michael Brooks likes to use for a lot of people, it's not just this specific segment or this specific story, he's wrong. He's immediately attributing thoughts to Steve Pinker that have nothing to do with his book. 2 points here in, a 10-second sentence? Number one, it is not a delusion. Every single chart in the book is a fact. People get hit by lightning 97% less than they used to. That is a fact. People spend less time doing laundry than they used to. That is a fact. So to call it delusional makes absolutely no sense. Pinker is quite literally just stating facts in the book, besides the explanations for what is responsible for these improvements in our lives. And I will definitely get to that later. Number two, calling him empathy-free, as if this book saying how great the world is becoming is somehow a way for him to absolve himself of any guilt he might feel for living in a world where he has it so much better than everyone else. Or maybe he wrote the book for the reasons he stated. In the book, he says, so many people think the world is getting worse because of the things we see on the news all the time being bad, and cites many studies where people think the world is getting worse, but when they're asked about their own neighborhood, they say things are okay, and much, much more. He's trying to shed some optimism. He's trying to show people all the amazing things that humanity has done and can continue to do. Maybe that's what he's trying to do. It's not like he said it in the book. Or you can just attribute feelings to him that he's never admitted to having, like writing it so he doesn't feel guilty, so he doesn't have to feel empathy for people who have it worse than him. And he can just say, hey, look, you guys had it better than you did 100 years ago. Now, stop complaining about it and leave me alone. I wonder which way he actually feels.
And a big part of Pinker's propaganda on behalf of the sort of self-evident benefits of capitalism and rationality, which, we did an illicit history on this with Merrick Sullivan, People Should Become Patrons and Listen. There's a huge amount of, historical literacy, overlooking imperialism, colonialism, racism, labor unions, the role of power, all the stuff you'd expect. State investments. This guy is not, he's just he's not quite libertarian. He's more sort of third way neoliberal, very unimaginative, very boring stuff. Wouldn't be kind of new to anybody.
Maybe Pinker knows that bad things have happened because of capitalism. Maybe he knows all about imperialism, colonialism, and racism, and how terrible those things were and are. And maybe he's just pointing out the good things that have happened from capitalism. Maybe he's intentionally leaving all those bad things that have come from capitalism out of the book because that's not what the book is about. Maybe he's not trying to obfuscate the truth about capitalism, but show us the path that will lead to better things, and show us what a lot of us seem to not know, that the world is getting better. We can argue about the best way to move forward and continue these trends. That's fine. But he's not wrong about the fact that the world is better.
One of his things that he really hangs his shingle on is the idea of poverty decreasing. And in this segment, Mehdi Hassan on Al Jazeera does an excellent job of grilling him, and also a really great job of, once again, be skeptical of numbers and statistics and quote unquote facts, especially if you're talking about an actual thing like poverty. These things don't mean very much at all. And the skew and the presupposition and the design of how you even ask a question like, what is poverty, is fundamental to the enterprise. And of course, Pinker is totally unable to even assess that. And here he is hanging on to his numbers while Mehdi Hassan challenges him to enlarge the conversation.
And the graphs go in a particular direction.
You put them by ignoring data that doesn't fit your thesis.
Absolutely false. No.
Well,
which data?
Okay, well, let's talk about it. Let's take global poverty.
Yeah.
You have a chapter in the book on prosperity. You want to make the case that the world is more prosperous and less poor than ever before, and you point to data showing the number of people living on the extreme poverty line, as defined by the World Bank today at $1.90 a day, is down from 2 billion in 1990 to 700 million in 2015. The world is becoming middle class, you say. But surely you know, I know you know, because you're a very clever, well-qualified guy, that there are numerous studies and a number of scholars who dispute that poverty measure as arbitrary, as inaccurate, that in reality, to quote from a recent academic paper by an anthropologist at the LSE, quote, around 4 billion people remain in poverty today, around 2 billion remain hungry, more than ever before in history.
That completely irrelevant to which way the numbers have gone. Of course, the definition of extreme poverty is going to be arbitrary. If you make it higher, then more people will be in poverty. If you make it lower, fewer people.
Exactly.
But no matter what cutoff you set, the direction is downward.
That's not true. That's
yes,
not,
it is.
If you look at the work done by Jason Hickel at the LSE, if you take a poverty line of $5, 1 billion people have been added to the number of people on that poverty measure since 1981. The trend shows the exact opposite when you move it to $5 a day.
In terms of the proportion of people in poverty by that criteria?
No, the sheer number of people.
Yes,
1 billion people have been added to the poverty total since 1981.
Yes, but billions of people have been added to the world as a whole. What's relevant is the proportion.
But you also use absolute numbers in your book. You say it's gone down from 2 billion to 700 million.
Well, I note that by at least the most widely accepted definition of extreme poverty, it's interesting that the absolute numbers have declined as well. But the main point is the proportion, because more people have been added, so anything is going to increase.
You say widely accepted, but this is my point. You don't acknowledge in the book, there's no caveats where you say, for example, Professor Lant Pritchett, Harvard colleague of yours, a development economist who studies this stuff, says the poverty line shouldn't be $1.90, it should be $12, $15 a day. And when you make that simple statistical change, the entire picture of poverty changes, and the arguments in your book basically fall apart, do they?
That's exactly right. And that is exactly the fundamental thing right here. It's not just a number. What's the context you're using?
If you were paying attention to Pinker's answers, the context he was using for $1.90 per day is the definition of extreme poverty by the World Bank. The World Bank is an organization created by the United Nations. There is no other higher authority that sets a standard definition of extreme poverty. What would you like Steve Pinker to do? Do you want the number in the book to change based on the person's definition of who's reading it? Sadly, we don't have the technology for that yet. Do not get angry at the guy who wrote the book like he's trying to hide the real truth that the world actually sucks. You can argue that less people being in extreme poverty doesn't even mean much because of reasons X, Y, and Z, but do not blame the guy using the standard definition of poverty for his cutoff line because you don't like the picture it paints. He says he uses the most widely accepted definition of extreme poverty, and the guy in the interview says that Pinker doesn't add caveats to the book, saying, well, if you change the poverty line to $15 a day instead of $1.90, then the data doesn't work. Okay, you can tell that Harvard professor that he's quoting, Lance Pritchett, to tell the World Bank to change their definition of extreme poverty. And until they do, stop accusing Pinker of trying to paint too rosy of a picture about the world. Why don't you go and ask him, what about $500 a day? I think that should be the poverty line.
I want you guys to jump in a second, but first let's read. This is Jason Hickel, who is the academic that Mehdi-Hassan cites there. He has a great thread about this on Twitter. He's an anthropologist and writer at The Guardian and other areas and other papers. He says, one, for the sake of argument, let's accept for the moment that the percentage of people in poverty is the only relevant indicator of progress. Even so, there's still a flaw in Pinker's claim and that of his supporters at the Cato Institute and the Adam Smith Institute.
Always worthwhile to point that connection out.
Always worth pointing that connection out, indeed. Pinker's claim is not a neutral argument about progress. He claims that progress has been driven specifically by globalization of free market capitalism. But there are a number of problems with this claim. From 1980 to 2000, the percentage of people under 5 a day increased from 70.8% to 73% due to structural adjustment programs that were imposed by the World Bank and IMF in this period. In other words, precisely during the period when free market globalization was at its purest and most aggressive, global poverty was getting worse even according to the proportions. What is more, for Pinker's claim to work, he can't include China, where economic integration has been in state-led terms. Take China out, and the percentage of people under 5 a day increased from 62% in 1980 to 67% in 2000, and did not improve on its 1980 levels until 2010. Ultimately, the morally relevant metric of progress is neither percentage or absolute numbers, but the extent of global poverty vis-a-vis our capacity to end it. And by that measure, we are doing worse than at any time in history. Hashtag inequality.
That is a mic drop.
That's a total mic
Suck
drop.
it, stinker.
All right, let's go through these tweets. Right off the bat, Hickel says, let's accept for a moment that the percent of people in poverty is the only relevant indicator of progress. I don't know if that's a dig at Pinker, that he thinks Pinker thinks that's the only thing that's the relevant indicator of progress. But in case he does, no, I doubt Pinker does think that, because he only included about 1 million other facts and graphs in the book showing how else the world has gotten better. Anyway, let's move on. From 1980 to 2000, the percent of people under $5 a day increased. Now that's cherry picking. So not only does he use $5 a day instead of Pinker's $1.90 a day, that once again the World Bank has ordained as the number for extreme poverty, not only does he use $5 a day, he uses the time frame of 1980 to 2000. I don't know the numbers of 1980 to 2010, or 1980 to 2015, or 1950 to 2000, and I don't want to assume that the trends are different if you extend the date either backwards or forwards or both ways. I just want to point out that's major cherry picking, and once again has nothing to do with Pinker's numbers. And to think Pinker would disagree with him on that because of what's written in his book doesn't make any sense. Pinker can easily agree with what you just said, that the number of people under $5 a day increased in that time period, and that would refute his argument about the globalization of free market capitalism being the thing that has driven the most progress towards ending poverty. That's a good point. As cherry-picked as the evidence is, I'm in agreement there, but that is not something that disproves, like, both things can be true at the same time. You can take data that proves his reasoning for the world getting better is wrong, but his facts, however cherry-picked they are correct, and your fact, however cherry-picked it is correct, and they can both be correct at the same time. And the last tweet, the mic drop, I'll repeat it again here. The morally relevant metric of progress is neither percentage nor absolute numbers, but the extent of global poverty vis-a-vis our capacity to end it, and by that measure we are doing worse than at any time in history. At first, I thought this was a good point, and after thinking about it, it's still pretty decent. But once again, I have to bring up, Pinker does not use the metric of our capacity to end global poverty in his book. He uses the actual numbers of people in poverty. Do you think he's not using your metric because he's secretly trying to shill for free market capitalism? Or just maybe he used metrics defined by the World Bank and other generally accepted metrics and didn't think to include yours. And now you're going to get angry at him because his story and his facts don't fly by a metric that you have artificially placed. I tried to give people the benefit of the doubt and assume they say and do things in good faith, assuming they have brains like me, they think like me, they want to make the world a better place, and some people just disagree on how we do it. How can you hear Steve Pinker speak and think he's got some ulterior motive to keep the rich on a pedestal? Can we not let somebody talk about the good news in the world for once? This is a feel-good book trying to get people's hopes up for the future of the world. He's trying to show people that the news they receive is biased in a negative way because that captures people's attention the most. You're in such disbelief that he attributes the fall in poverty to capitalism that you literally try to dispute the idea of what poverty is and change the metrics so you can continue to believe your worldview is what is best. It's possible for his numbers to be correct and the world to be getting better, while also disagreeing with where capitalism is taking us. It's not that hard. You can debate it all you want, but the fact that more people make over $1.90 a day, percentage-wise, than they used to, is a good thing. Look, I understand lots of people in the United States and the West are struggling. People who don't think on the scale of $1.95 a day. I'm one of these people struggling. But we have to understand that we can acknowledge the good things while also focusing most of our energy on the problems we still have at hand and the new ones that form. Here's another tweet I came across, and we're talking about people with 30,000 followers, hundreds of thousands of followers. And this isn't just two different people. There are many, many examples. There are many people with large platforms talking about this. There is a whole wave of opposition behind this. This person with 30,000 followers said, aside from being factual bunk, the cruel optimism of Pinker and ilk, there's a whole industry of this stuff, including a new book endorsed by the Gateses, is underwritten by callous class indifference styled as Olympian detachment from the quiddity of suffering. This is his response to seeing that interview of Steven Pinker where the guy grills him on the definition, the arbitrary line of poverty. And I'm sitting here like, wow, people actually believe this stuff. People have jumped to that far of a conclusion about these people like Steve Pinker and what's that? Bill Gates? That's right. People are involving Bill Gates in this because Bill Gates said, Enlightenment Now is my new favorite book of all time. What's that you say? The Bill Gates that has done more to lift people out of poverty and high child mortality rates than probably any other person in the history of mankind? Yes, that Bill Gates. Are we not allowed to celebrate good things or good trends like Bill Gates does with the reduction of malaria cases? Is Bill Gates also suffering from class indifference because he talked about how great Pinker's book was? It's callous class indifference when you tell people how much better the world is for everyone, not in your own class, the Bill Gates and the Steve Pinkers of the world. Just because the 1%ers or the 5%ers of the world, whatever they may be, do research and make media waves by talking about good in the world does not make them detached from the realities of the bad. I gotta say, my conclusion, based on who's agreeing with these attacks on Pinker, is that they associate him with the other people he's talked to in the past. Some people they dislike, and so they subconsciously want to nitpick at everything he says and does to prove he's just a fraud or an idiot like the people he associates with. I'm not saying that's acting in bad faith, although it could be, but I assume most people doing it don't even realize they are attacking the guy because their subconscious mind just tries to find a way to attack him because he associates with people they truly have disdain for, like having an interview with Dave Rubin. And hey, I dislike Dave Rubin too, but I am doing my diligence to make sure I don't automatically hate every person he's had a conversation with and actually listen to what they have to say. Please stop trying to make enemies with those who should be your strongest allies. And now, having said that, I'd like to present to you someone who fits the very mold that I just talked about. And before I go on to these tweets that this person wrote, yes, it's another Twitter thread by a professor with a large following once again. I want to add that I think he goes way further than somebody like Michael Brooks does, or anyone else I mentioned so far. This person first notes that Pinker and Sam Harris are getting a drubbing in reviews of their books or their articles or their podcasts, and says that their fans come to their defense. And he says that the people that follow Pinker or Harris cannot handle the idea that maybe things the way they are or the way they magically were in the 50s might not be the best and might require change. First off, Pinker and Harris do not dabble in the same subjects. Their fields of expertise are very different and they both do work on very different things. But why were they included together? Because they talk to each other on Sam's podcast. Maybe twice, once or twice. And now, all of a sudden, that means they get grouped together. Pinker doesn't have a podcast. They have two completely different careers and do completely different things. Anyway, let's get to that point. Their fans cannot handle the idea that maybe things the way they are or the way they were in the 50s might not be the best and might require change. It sounds a lot like those people would be conservatives then, right? Where you don't want things to change, aka you want to be conservative, except the book could not be a better advertisement for why change is good. Sam and Pinker are both very liberal when it comes to wanting to make changes in society. And writing a book saying the world is getting better does not mean Pinker wants the world to stay the same as it is today. And Pinker especially doesn't think things should be going back to the way they were in the 50s, because the entire book is about how things have gotten better and better since the 50s and before the 50s. Next, he says, this pablum, aka baby food, is fed to his fans in the form of selective data, in quotes, data via roundly discredited fields like evolutionary psychology, and tells them that, quote unquote, science proves the world is as it should be and is getting better. And then in parentheses, well, except for recently when those pesky non-whites got uppity. Aside the inference that these people are racists and referring to the information they take in as baby food, I'm going to go ahead and gloss over that. Also, I'll skip a tweet where he completely disparages Pinker and Harris's credentials as if them not being real professors or real scientists or real this or real that actually makes a difference in what they say being true or not. Then he says, but in the end, putting things aright for them means convincing everyone that a white and Whiggish view of the world, in which white and Whiggish types are on top because of evolution and enlightenment, is the right one, and those who want to change it are benighted fools. Let me start by saying there are some people that might fit the description of this tweet, but Steve Pinker is not one of them. And I've said this about 1,000 times, I'm going to say it 1,001. Do not attribute thoughts to people that haven't said those thoughts. Pinker never says anything about white people being on top or Whiggish people being on top. This guy has a nice definition of the word Whiggish, just in case anyone was wondering. Whiggish history is the idea that, hey, things are pretty good for me and people like me, so that means all of history has progressed to this point to advantage me, and that's clearly good and will clearly continue. Given the choice, all would want to be like me. We can see that the biggest improvements in the world, the most progression, is coming from non-white places. And Pinker's trying to highlight that. How do you not see this? How can you say he's trying to convince everyone white and Whiggish types are on top, when the things he talks about, like the rates of child mortality and extreme poverty, overwhelmingly affect non-whites and non-Westerners? Can nobody be happy about incremental progress because there's still a racial wealth gap and people living in poverty? Are we not allowed to write optimistic things about the world? Is any good news taboo to report on because there's still people starving in Africa? Or there's still a poor black guy in Chicago? And this Twitter professor continues. It's all pablum. Comforting, watered-down mush for those who are scared of a world changing in ways that might not advantage them, and who are soothed by quote-unquote data that says they really are the best, and they get to be pretentious about being skeptics to boot. How can you possibly take this book as Pinker patting himself on the back, that people like him are responsible for all the improvements in the world? It's just absolutely insane. It's assuming the worst intentions of someone because of what I can only assume is his relationship with some other person you don't like. And you think this is comforting for white people to hear? Do you think poor white people feel better if they read a book about how the rest of the world is becoming more developed while they struggle to put food on the table? Do you think that comforts them? Do you think they're soothed by the data because in your universe it massages their ego, as if they're the ones responsible? I can tell you right now that there is not a single poor or racist white person that would feel better about themselves after reading that book. Do you think the purpose, or even just a little bit of purpose, of this book was so that somebody could say, hey, infant mortality rate and hunger has declined so much, I feel better about it, not because that is a good thing no matter how you look at it, but because I'm part of the group responsible for it? And what do you mean when you say people are scared of a world changing in ways that might not advantage them? Most of the book is about how great the world has gotten for everyone. Less time doing laundry, less time getting struck by lightning. The reduction in childhood mortality rate and extreme poverty are only two facts in a book full of facts. The book does talk about ways in which the world is becoming better for them. And to say they're soothed by the data, not because of how optimistic it is, but because it says that their way of thinking is the reason we got here, is insane. Pinker is highlighting the fact of how amazing it is that this progress has happened. It's in the book. He says, we will never have a perfect world, and it would be dangerous to seek one. But there is no limit to the betterments we can attain if we continue to apply knowledge to enhance human flourishing. End quote. We've got new problems springing up in the place of less infants dying. These are lesser problems, of course, but still problems. And just because Pinker didn't write about wealth inequality and the racial wealth gap and all the other problems that we have today, doesn't mean he doesn't care about them. Would you like to accuse Bill Gates of being soothed by the data that says people like him are really the best? Do you think he's looking for an excuse to inflate his ego? Or, hear me out on this one, maybe he likes the book because it highlights all of the good things that have happened in the world that not many people know about. Do you think he likes it because of that? Or because of the hidden message in the book that only these critics of the book have found? The real message that Pinker is trying to convey, that you know because you can read his mind, is that people like him know best and that you should trust people like him. And also that the way he thinks being key to continuing these good trends is somehow not shared, that everyone else somehow does not share these same principles and does not think this is the way forward, and that only people like him can take credit for it. Do you want to tell Bill Gates, while he's donating billions of dollars to help eradicate malaria in Africa, do you want to tell him he's white-splaining how to make the world a better place? And to let a person of color decide how to spend that money instead? Are you really going to get angry at someone for helping to eradicate childhood mortality just because they're white? Just because they're rich? Just because it makes them feel better about themselves to help other people? Bill Gates is one of the few people whose ego should be inflated. Should people in the United States and Europe not use the technologies and the scientific advancements they've made in recent years to help underdeveloped countries continue to thrive and continue to get out of poverty, in fear that they might take credit for it and feel better about themselves? Give me a break. The guy who wrote this Twitter thread should be ashamed of himself. I feel like I'm trying to defend the author of The Very Hungry Caterpillar here, and that if he wrote it today, everyone would be like, why are you writing a children's book about such a happy, funny caterpillar when there's a racial wealth gap and women only make 70 cents to men's $1? Why are you writing good news? Why are you writing happy things? Don't you feel guilty for writing about such good things while the world is in so much turmoil? You just want to feel good about yourself, don't you? You just want to point out, hey, look, you see everything getting better? That's because of science, things that I value so much. So see, I'm kind of responsible for it too, if you think about it. That is me mocking someone who would be mocking Steven Pinker for writing that book. How ridiculous does that sound? You're not allowed to write about good news. Not if I disagree with the reasons for why that good news happened. Instead of just politely disagreeing with you about how those things came to occur, I am instead going to assume the worst motives of you and just try to assassinate your character as much as I possibly can. Alright, that's gonna do it for me. I feel like a broken record in this episode, but hopefully repeating the same thing enough times will get people to understand it. And if there's one lesson to take away from this story, it is please assume that the person you disagree with is only just trying to do what they think is best for their fellow human beings. I know not everyone is trying to do what's best for everybody, but most people are. And usually it's easy to tell when someone only cares about themselves. So just keep that in mind the next time you find yourself disagreeing with someone, and don't assume the worst. Never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. And a lot of times, the word stupidity can be replaced with ignorance or a different point of view. Very innocent, forgivable reasons as to why someone might disagree with you.